From his earliest comments to the rants that drove headlines around the world, here is what happened when Joe Rogan's real opinion on trans athletes is exposed. Joe Rogan is a man who is never too far away from dipping into controversy, but even by his own lofty standards, this entire saga has attracted attention from far outside the world of sport. So what exactly happened? Well, back in 2018, Joe was hosting an episode of his podcast alongside comedian Tom Segura. And for whatever reason, the subject of trans athletes came up, and specifically how being a male-to-female transgender athlete could have an effect when you're competing against biological women. Rogan was very clearly against the idea, citing major physical differences in men and women that become much more prominent after puberty. To quote Joe directly, he brought forth a number of points about both the idea of transgender women competing against biological women, as well as some words for those who defend this idea vocally. He first took aim at the people who denied that there was an uneven playing ground, saying, "This ideology is cult-like. The bone structure is so different, and the people who deny that are effing crazy." And while Rogan admitted that the subject matter was tricky to navigate, in his mind, biological women who compete in sports are the ones who have to pay the price. We want to save people's feelings, and what's fascinating in the process is that you go toward the most maligned section of society, which are transgender people. But women get fed on the deal. They get fed hard. I think it's completely unfair. Naturally, the quotes were taken and became massive news, both within the world of sport and beyond. Given that Joe spends hours upon hours every week with a microphone in front of his face, it's only natural that he draws a lot of unwanted attention from time to time. But on this subject, he certainly managed to get more than he bargained for. Many activists within the trans community went after Joe as they felt that he was throwing logs on the fire of prejudice against a group of people within society who already had enough on their plate. Whenever he had the chance, Joe would counter this by stating that he is not in any way trying to be hateful towards trans people, but instead he is just speaking his mind in a realistic way about a sport that he knows a lot more than most about. And in his mind, there's nothing wrong with speaking harsh truths, especially when it comes to combat sports. In Joe's opinion, the differences in bone structure and general physical strength translate into huge differences when it comes to power, explosiveness, and speed. And in his mind, the idea of setting up a fight between someone who was born a male and their opponent a biological female is a totally uneven playing field. And he has repeatedly stated in the past that putting the biological females at a disadvantage like this is truly unfair. As unfortunate as the whole situation is, he reiterated a lot of these points in 2020 during another JRE episode where the subject came up. This time, he spoke about the differences in fast-twitch muscle fibers. Something like that impacts the ability to make sharp and explosive movements, and how that, along with bone density, ends up making a matchup between a biological male who recently transitioned and a biological female totally unfair by his estimation. He reiterated this point in a 2021 interview with Jim Brewer, making a more direct stance while criticizing the trans community for not seeing his reason and rationale on the issue. He said the trans community were not assessing the issue. It's because they're indoctrinated into an ideology that demands that you comply. And it's not the first time that Joe has clashed with left-leaning activists. Although he himself identifies as liberal in his views, Rogan's podcast became a major source of controversy during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the veteran podcaster was accused of pushing baseless theories about the virus that had no roots in actual science. This came to the fore most when Rogan spoke about using ivermectin to treat his own bout with the coronavirus. In the end, several musical artists, including Canadian legend Neil Young, removed their music from Spotify out of protest, claiming that Joe was spreading misinformation, or at the very least, not doing enough with his platform to combat the spread of misinformation. Another figure who is never too far away from a huge dose of controversy is the clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson, who appeared on a 2022 edition of Rogan's podcast, where they discussed the backlash that they shared with the trans community because of their stances. Peterson, who pretty much shot to global fame on the back of his conflict with the trans community, claimed that being transgender is a result of a contagion and similar to satanic ritual abuse. Seems like a bit of a stretch, right? Well, to get the comments within the context of the interview itself, you'd be better off watching the full video. Later in 2022, during a podcast episode with Peter Attia, Rogan attempted to clarify his position, making it clear that his take on sports has nothing to do with his take on transgender people overall. It just blows my mind. It has nothing to do with transphobia. We're talking about fairness in sports. With millions of followers and a diverse range of guests, the Joe Rogan Experience podcast is without question the most popular show of its type in the world. Joe Rogan's candid and unfiltered style has made him a polarizing figure, and it's not just the transgender community who have taken issue with him. His willingness to openly discuss his viewpoints, often without the filter of political correctness, does leave him as an easy target for people who like to make video clips and report them as news. But on this subject, there is a certain amount of misrepresentation of his actual views. While some admire his ability to tackle controversial topics head-on, others accuse him of promoting harmful ideas and perpetuating misinformation. Critics argue that his comments reinforce stereotypes and undermine the struggles faced by transgender athletes seeking inclusivity and acceptance. Rogan counters this by claiming that the sport should not be made unfair simply to push something that has little to do with it. But the controversy doesn't just end with what he says. He has hosted individuals known for their controversial and transphobic views, providing them with a platform to amplify their harmful rhetoric. Critics argue that by giving these voices a platform, Rogan is complicit in perpetuating discrimination and furthering the marginalization of these people. It's an argument that does have some weight, but Joe himself would argue that the people making it aren't considering how they affect the merits of true sports competition. Joe clashed pretty heavily with Adam Conover on a now infamous episode of the podcast, where Conover basically bit off way more than he could chew. In trying to debate this lifelong martial artist, Conover was widely mocked for his attempts to get one over on Joe, with many people noting that it seemed like Adam had never actually had a proper debate with someone who wouldn't just lie down and take his BS. And Joe, as you might expect, very calmly dealt with all of his questions. Conover seemed to believe that sports could be changed to even the playing field, something that would allow men and women to compete at the same time. And yeah, telling that to a longtime UFC commentator, it went just about as well as you might expect. Many fans point to this as the single worst guest in the JRE back catalog, but we'll let you be the judge of that. Either way, Rogan's platform and immense job security under the Spotify banner, and pretty much going to ensure that he is untouchable as far as any of these constant controversies are concerned. But even still, Rogan has more than enough supporters to truly feel the pressure of a small but vocal minority of his listeners. From the earliest seeds of this drawn-out saga to his doubling down on the points that made him an enemy to an entire portion of society, those have been Joe Rogan's real opinions on the controversy surrounding the inclusion of trans women in sports that give them a physical advantage.